Parsondale. One of the large law firms in Salt Lake that we work with quite a bit. We've had others come from that firm talk. In that capacity, he's worked with a lot of different entities, advising them in this area, and also has put together some best practices in this area for Salt Lake County and others that he'll speak to today. So I'm going to identify some of the bigger issues that have to do with drones rather than just simply falling out of the sky.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. It's a gorgeous setting. It's a lot cooler here in Salt Lake. You know, as a society, we're kind of obsessed with the next big thing. Well, the next big thing is not unmanned aerial vehicles, or euphemistically referred to as drones. They are here. They are here, and we need to address them, both individually, as a society as a whole, and certainly governments. The research firm Gartner estimates that the global market revenue for unmanned aerial vehicles for 2017 will be $6 billion. $6 billion. They estimate that will increase to about $12 billion by 2020. The FAA has predicted that there will be 22 million recreational drone users flying their drones by 2021. That's just in the United States alone. It's estimated there will be 3 million drones, recreational drones, will be sold to private citizens in 2017. That's about a 40% increase from sales from the prior year. So the recreational drone market is dramatically growing, and along with that, we're just beginning to see a new market develop, and that is anti-drone technology. Of course, a lot of government law enforcement officers are interested in that. You can't hear? So I'm not going to repeat any of that, but other than to say that the market for drones is dramatically increased. Can you hear me now in the back? Can't hear me? Raise your hand. All right. So along with this dramatic growth in the recreational market for drones, where citizens are using drones, governments are beginning to use them as well. Law enforcement has a particular interest in drone technology and in anti-drone technology, where the jamming of the radio waves that operate drones, drone rifles, or drone capture nets, they're being marketed. These are things that are of interest to law enforcement in particular, as the worry grows that criminals are going to be using drones in the commission of crime. So we've seen a huge acceleration in the growth of drones by government. Lots of cities are now using drones for crowd control and traffic management, fairs, and large public events. Several states are using drones for wildlife management, and law enforcement is incorporating drones for search and rescue, for hostage situations, and surveillance. So the government has an interest in learning about drones and learning how they work. I asked for a brief little survey to be done of you all about whether your entities currently utilize a drone, and over half of you said either you already have a drone that you're using or that you're contemplating acquiring one. A very great example, topical example of the use of drones and the problems that they can cause is the Hurricane Harvey right now. So first responders were using drones to locate persons who stranded. The Red Cross began using drones to deliver first aid and other supplies to people who were stranded. Allstate is using drones, and I think the other major insurance companies will soon follow in using drones to assess the extent of damage from Hurricane Harvey. I'm sure you've all seen some dramatic television footage about the devastation that's been caused by hurricane. A lot of that was taken by drones. Yesterday, the FAA issued a warning and a caution to encourage private owners not to fly their drones in the area. It is a federal crime to interfere with disaster relief or aid efforts through flying your drones. So drones are here. They're having an immediate impact, and they're going to have a greater impact in the future. So today, I'd like to talk about 4 topics. The current regulatory landscape. Things are a little muddled, as we will see. Talk a little bit about no-fly zones. Talk about what you're maybe interested in, I'm sure, which is managing the risks that are created by drones, not only when citizens use drones, but when government uses drones as well. And then we'll talk briefly about what considerations you should take into account when you are developing a drone policy. And I would urge all of you to develop a drone policy. All right, so let's look at the current regulatory landscape. Of course, that must start at the federal level with the Federal Aviation Administration. In 2012, Congress gave the FAA control over the regulation of unmanned aerial systems. I'm sure you know, the FAA has exclusive jurisdiction over navigable airspace. Essentially is anything that's over 400 feet. The FAA dragged its feet a little bit, even though Congress imposed a strict deadline on them to gave them a mandate to incorporate the flying of drones into the U.S. Navigable airspace. The FAA did not meet its deadline. It dragged its feet. There was a large vacuum, if you will, for a while. And as a consequence, states and even some municipalities and counties entered that void, vacuum, and began enacting legislation that would regulate drones. There are now 48 states, including Utah, that have laws on the books that regulate the use of drones. Now the FAA has promulgated its rules. They're still in the final stage of final approval, adoption, but it looks like what has been put out for public comment is going to be the final version of the rules. So there's been a history of frustration between the federal government and state and local governments over this issue. Not the first time we've had tensions between the federal government and local governments, but it was particularly acute over in this area. So I thought you might enjoy this little cartoon that sort of illustrates the relationship, at least to date, between the FAA and state and local governments. All right, well, hopefully that is in the past. I don't know if you can, those in the back of the room can read it, but it'll be part of the handouts that you can look at later. Regardless of the tensions and regardless of the muddled area and muddled landscape between who has authority to regulate the use of drones, one thing is clear. Government entities under the federal law really have 2 options for operating drones. Either you can fly under what's called the Part 107 rule. It's small UAS, unmanned aerial systems, and that's the term that the federal government uses to connote that it's more than just the physical drone that they have regulatory authority over, but it's also the systems that operate the drone as well. So unmanned aerial systems is the term that they use, but for our purposes today, we'll just refer to them as drones. So that's the first option, that government may have authority to operate its own drone under the small UAS rule. The other way to operate a drone is to obtain a certificate of authorization from the FAA. So how many of you have entities that have obtained a certificate of authorization? Only one? Really, only one?
Well, just case in point, the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012, and I'll quote right here, it says the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration may not promulgate any rule or regulation regarding a model aircraft or an aircraft being developed as a model aircraft. That was used to overturn the registration rule. And that has been overturned right now before the appellate court.
Sure. That's a little off topic, but it's a relevant one. So right now, the FAA promulgated this registration requirements and applied it to essentially what are model aircraft hobbyists. The courts have overturned that. They have not overturned the registration requirement for governments operating things that are not defined as a model aircraft. So if you as a county are operating a model aircraft, yeah, you don't need to worry about it. And you don't need to worry about a lot of things. But my understanding is that those of your entities that do have drones, they're not model aircraft. They're used for search and rescue. They're used for law enforcement purposes and things of that nature. So, way in the back, you got a certificate of authority from the FAA?
We do. We got a wing number, then we got the authority.
All right, and what purposes are you using the drone for? What county are you from?
Davis County, and we use it for investigations, traffic control, up the canyon, over the lake.
Okay. All right, so how many of you who are operating drones, others than Davis County, are operating under the UAS, small UAS rule? The rest of you are just, yes, you
We
are.
have held back.
Pardon?
We have held back on the drones, but we're in the process of getting one. We're going to obtain a certificate of authorization.
Okay, so the rest of you, if there are any media here, the rest of you are not complying with the law, or?
We bought it, but we're not using it yet.
So you've got them, you haven't used them yet. Okay, great. All right. So you either have to get a certificate of authorization, or you're going to have to operate it under the UAS, small UAS rule. Now, for Davis County, once your certificate of authorization expires, unless the FAA decides differently, you're going to have to comply with the small UAS rule. So, all right, let's review kind of what the requirements are to comply with Part 107 is how it's referred to. The drone must be less than 55 pounds. That's not usually a problem. In fact, if it's under a half a pound, it automatically falls within the model aircraft rule, and the rules and regulations do not apply. You must register your drone with the FAA. And there have been several 100,000 private citizens have already done so. Lots of governments that have gotten beyond the point of just buying a drone and actually using a drone. They must register as well. Under the current Part 107 rules, you may operate a drone in visual line of sight only. That means even though the drone is technologically capable of being programmed, so you could fly it over the hill, into the next valley, perform its mission, and then return automatically back to the home station. That is not permitted under the Part 107 rules because you lost visual sight of the drone.
Have to be visual sight with the naked eye?
Yes, good question. It cannot be through telescopes or binoculars and things of that nature. Now, this is a little muddy area, but that's the way the FAA is currently interpreting. Good question back.
And it needs to be visual sight of the pilot, right? Not just somebody.
That's correct. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. We get to the pilot in command. Yes, sir.
They will allow spotters.
They will allow a spotter if you have a certificate of authorization that gives you an exemption from this requirement. We'll talk about waivers in a moment, but a very good point. All of these rules that I'm talking about are capable of being waived by the FAA, but you need to apply for a waiver. There's an online form to do it, or you need to have the waiver of the requirement in your certificate of authorization. So the drone's got to be under 55 pounds. You have to register it with the FAA, and that means you got to have a drone number, a registration number. It has to be displayed on the aircraft itself, so that people, if it crashes, someone knows who's the owner and operator of it. It must be visual line of sight only. It must fly under 400 feet and daylight only. Now the FAA has issued some guidance that says the 400 feet is usually above ground level, but if you're flying it over a structure, it can be 400 feet over that structure. So 400 feet over a skyscraper or things of that nature. They define daylight only as a half hour just before dusk and a half hour after dusk. One of the main limitations is that you may not fly your drone over people or from a moving vehicle. So you can't maintain your visual line of sight by driving in your car and following the drone. Now, you could do that if you got a waiver of that exemption through your certificate of authorization. And a lot of these rules are being waived, particularly in law enforcement arenas with search and rescue and looking for missing persons and things of that nature. The Part 107 rules also establish this concept of pilot in command. Now, that usually means the person operating the controls of the drone, but it does not necessarily have to be that. You could have, there are some law enforcement agencies, like in Los Angeles and New York, that have dozens and dozens of drones. And they have one person who is the pilot in command. And that person is the one who trains and supervises the operators. The pilot in command, as far as the FAA is concerned, is the person who's responsible. They're the person who's going to be held accountable if there's a violation, if there's some mishap or something of that nature. Another another part of Rule 107, Part 107, is that you obviously must yield to manned aircraft. The biggest concern that the FAA has is people flying drones near airports, otherwise, if they fly too high, they might have a collision or near collision with a manned aircraft. Safety is the FAA's primary charge, and safety sort of trumps everything else. Forget convenience, forget money revenue, forget other services. If it has an adverse impact on safety, the FAA is going to be concerned and most likely not allow you to use a drone. You must report any accident to the FAA involving a drone within 10 days. Now, they said that you only have to report an accident if there's serious bodily injury or if there's been damage that exceeds $500, either to the drone itself or the property on the ground that resulted in damage. I would suspect that many of you, when you're contemplating a drone policy, you're going to want to track any accident, regardless of whether there's physical injury or property damage. You're going to want to, just from a risk management perspective, keep a record so you can look for patterns and things of that nature. Yes?
Why does the FAA care if I wreck my drone and destroy it and have to get a new one?
Well, because they're trying to gather up data and information to know whether there really is a serious threat of potential injury or structured property through the operation of drones. So one way they know about how many drones are operating is by the registration requirement. They're not required to, hobbyists aren't required to report those. And that's why they said, but even if you're a hobbyist, if you've got, you're operating a drone and it causes $500 damage, they want to know about it. So it's really a data collection way. Now, for all intents and purposes, the FAA is not going to prosecute or impose some sanction on someone who has an injury or damage of $1,000 or whatever. They're just not going to be concerned about that. You also may not operate within 5 miles of an airport or a heliport. So if you are operating in a county that has an airport that maybe you operate yourself, or then this will be of concern to you, and you will want to address it in your certificate of authorization, because you're going to want law enforcement to be able to fly within 5 miles of an airport under certain circumstances. So that's the federal law. It's a little muddied in some areas. We're going to see it get fleshed out as the FAA issues guidance on how to implement these rules. Undoubtedly, there are going to be more court challenges, and we'll see the courts weigh in on this issue as well. You're absolutely correct that the Court of Appeals has stricken that part of the 2012 Modernization Act that granted the FAA authority to regulate all aircraft, and they defined all aircraft to include model aircraft. That so that FAA no longer has jurisdiction. You go buy Johnny $99 drone from Walmart. He doesn't have to register that and doesn't have to comply with any of these rules. Yes.
And I totally agree with you, but in looking at this, it makes me wonder if, for example, we've got drones, our tourism department has them, the sheriff's office has them, our public works department has them. Do they have to pass a written test to be the pilot? Are we considered a commercial operation? I know that commercially they're requiring drone pilots to do jobs for pay.
Which county are you from?
Washington.
Washington County, okay. The short answer is yes. You've got to have a certified pilot. Now, if you have your regular pilot's license, that qualifies. They're now having testing for just drone operators, much less onerous. But you're going to want that from a risk management perspective anyway, because if you have an operator that causes damage or injury to someone else, and we'll talk about some of the risks, it's going to really be, from a legal perspective, you're going to be much better, have a sounder defense to that claim if you've got a certified pilot operating, as opposed to someone who's not. All right, any other questions about the federal law? And this is there's a lot of moving parts right now, and we're living through it as it's getting developed. But you as a government entity not only have to worry about compliance with the federal law, but you've also got to worry about compliance with Utah state law. And the state legislature has enacted 3 bills that you need to be concerned with. And I've got, in the handouts that will be distributed afterwards, I've got summaries of each of these bills. Now there's an open legal issue about whether some of the provisions in the state laws that have been passed conflict with the federal law and whether the federal law preempts. And one day, a court will have to weigh in on that issue, but from your perspective as risk managers, you should pay attention to these laws until they're stricken down. So let's look at the first one, which was passed in this last legislative session, Senate Bill 111. Probably the most important provision for you all is that it preempts local regulation. It specifically states that local governments may not enact any law or ordinance governing the private use of drones unless the government is an airport operator. So I can't help but note there's a little irony here in that states and local governments have screamed bloody murder about the federal government imposing rules, one size that fits all, and not recognizing the difference between the needs of different counties and municipalities, and yet the state legislature turns around and does the same thing and says, you as a rural county, you've got to abide by the same laws that a more urban county does as well. And by the way, you can't enact your own laws. You've got to defer to us. Now, it applies to regulation of the private use of drones. So for example, say you have a park. One of the issues that's going to come up is, are you going to allow your citizens to fly their drone in the park? I'm sure you have regulations, time, use, and manner restrictions on the park. Park closes at 11 p.m. You can't have alcohol in the park. Maybe you have dogs, maybe you can't. If you do, they've got to be on a leash or not. You can't, there are all sorts of rules and regulations about the use of public property. Well, a strict reading of this SB 11 says you cannot enact any law or ordinance that purports to regulate the private use of drones. So that's something that really needs to be addressed, I think, legislatively in the future. I know government entities in other states, some have said, we're just not going to allow drones to be flown in our parks because they're too near populated areas or whatever. Others have said, we'll allow drones to be used in our parks, but you have to apply for a permit because we want to make sure that the drone's not too big. We want to make sure that the drone does not have a weapon on it. We want to make sure that if the drone has a video camera, that you're not going to fly it outside of the park, and maybe it be privacy invasive of neighbors who live next to the park, whatever. So there are lots of reasons why government may want to regulate the private use of drones by citizens over public property. That's potentially a big problem here under the current law in Utah. SB 111, in addition to sort of preempting local regulation over the private use of drones, also enacts some special rules when drones are being used by law enforcement. So for those of you who have, like Washington County, that have drones that are being that law enforcement is using, or for those of you who are contemplating getting a drone, you've got to comply with those special rules. Basically, and I've got a summary here so you can look at this at your leisure, but the main things you need to remember is that drones, the law enforcement cannot use a drone to collect data unless one of three circumstances exist. They get a search warrant, or there's some judicially recognized exception to a search warrant, like what's called exigent circumstances, witnessing a crime right now, or an emergency situation. You can also use a drone, law enforcement use a drone to locate a missing person. And then finally, you can, law enforcement can use a drone for any purposes that's unrelated to a criminal investigation. So, rescue, disaster relief, things of that nature. The legislature's main concern was Big Brother. They didn't want the government surveilling and tracking and invading people's privacy. And the main protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, which the Fourth Amendment protects, is a search warrant. Another requirement that this SB 111 imposes on law enforcement is that they must destroy any drone data as soon as reasonably possible. Now, there's some exceptions in that. We don't have time to kind of go through all of them, but that's a significant obligation. And perhaps just as important is that it obligates law enforcement to keep certain records regarding their drone use. When do they fly them? Who flies them? How long were they flown? What purpose? For what purpose were they flown? What data did they gather? Etc. SB 111 also bans the operation of a drone with a weapon, unless they get a certificate of authorization from the FAA or the state grants. I'm not aware of any other than the military, which doesn't operate drones domestically, that have gotten permission from the FAA to have a weaponized drone. That's obviously a big concern. SB 11 also enacts some rules relating to the recreational flying of drones. It basically parrots the FAA model aircraft rules. Another requirement of SB 111 that's very important for local government, for law enforcement, is that it affirmatively obligates law enforcement to issue written warnings for violation of the state rules, and then prosecute persons who violate the rules. So now, law enforcement suddenly is going to, just like they have to prosecute keeping toms and people who violate the statute against voyeurism, or are now going to have to be prosecuting and enforcing laws relating to privacy invasions through drones. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The penalties range from infractions up to misdemeanors. There's a huge issue about whether the use of drones would constitute a trespass under existing law, would constitute voyeurism if the drone were equipped with a camera. And the legislature tends to address those by expressly amending those statutes to include the use of a drone in sort of committing those crimes. So this was a good, one of the good developments of that law, in that it helps clarify that ambiguity. Yes.
Could you clarify, so law enforcement, they have to have physical evidence license as well as some sort of testing then whoever is operating that, is that correct?
Yes.
With law enforcement?
They must have training as well.
Can you repeat that question?
Oh, the question was whether does law enforcement also have to have a pilot in command and be a certified drone operator? The answer is yes. All right, so that's SB 111. Like I said, there's a little summary in the handouts that you can refer to. Let's talk about the other act that was passed, House Bill 217. This prohibits the use of a drone to intentionally disturb or harm livestock. In numerous reports, not only here in Utah, but in other western areas, where people are flying their drones over livestock, and it causes, trauma, and they don't produce milk, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a serious issue, serious enough that the legislature passed a specific law that makes that a crime. Now, for your purposes, one good exemption is that government officers, if they're acting within their scope of their official capacity, they are exempt from this law. So if you're a law enforcement person, flies a drone over and disturbs or harms livestock, they're not subject to liability under this act. House Bill 126 is the final piece of legislation that Utah has adopted, and it prohibits flying a drone within a certain distance of a wildfire. Now, this is somewhat duplicative of the federal law, which also prohibits such flights. But you know, the federal government's probably not going to prosecute if some person flies their drone close to a wildfire down in southern Utah or central Utah or whatever, particularly you know, in a small state like Utah. So the legislature felt like they needed to make this a state crime as well. So you may not fly your drone within a certain distance of a wildfire, and it's a misdemeanor if you do, but it becomes a felony if you interfere with the firefighting efforts, or if your drone crashes into a manned aircraft, and then it becomes a felony. Yes.
What if they're using the drone to, the firefighters are trying to see where the fire is?
Yeah, now, so one of the big unanswered questions with all of this state law, and even with the FAA rules and regulations, is will they apply to, say, a first responder or a law enforcement officer who is using the drone in connection with responding to a crime or something of that nature. I mean, from a practical perspective, I can't see that a U.S. attorney is going to prosecute a sheriff for using a drone to go rescue someone, even if they fly it more than 400 feet, they fly it faster than 100 miles an hour, which is another FAA rule. They flew it at night. They flew it over people who were over people. I just don't see that happening from a practical perspective, but the law technically will allow it. And the same thing, I don't see a local prosecutor prosecuting a local law enforcement if they're using the drone in a law enforcement purpose. So this is a good segue into this issue of preemption between the state laws and federal government. And like I said, 48 states have enacted some drone legislation. A lot of that either directly competes with the federal rules, or they're kind of on the fringes. So the FAA has exclusive jurisdiction over the safety of the navigable airspace. And it's very clear by court challenge that the cities and counties and local governments do not have any authority to regulate in that area. Where the big uncertainty is below 400 feet, and where they're attempting to regulate not the safety, but other issues like privacy or reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions or things of that nature. So what happens if the state wants to regulate to protect citizens' privacy from the use of drones, but the FAA says we regulate drones, and we regulate it because of safety concerns? So what if it's a mixed question of, well, we're not only concerned about safety, but also privacy? That's just an unclear area, and we're probably just going to have to work that through with court challenges. State and local governments have inherent police powers. So if you're going to be exercising your police power and by using a drone, there's a strong legal argument to be made that you can regulate in that area. And that, of course, is what the state has done. They've said you can't use it for law enforcement purposes or an investigation unless you get a search warrant. So this is going to be an important issue in the coming months and years, and likely we'll have to have that decided by the courts. And again, I've got a handout that sort of summarizes those issues. All right, so let's talk about some, well, any other questions about state law before I move on? Yes?
I heard the state tried to pass, but maybe it got struck, a law that said you couldn't fly it over private property without the permission of the property owner.
No, that is not, that is correct, but it passed.
It did
So,
pass.
yes, it had, as part of, and I'll talk about that in a moment when I get to the, to talk about the portion of the presentation about privacy. But yes, it is now a crime of trespass for you to fly your drone and linger there without the person's permission. Now, if you're flying it over someone's property to you're rescuing someone else or whatever, no prosecutor's ever going to prosecute you
But
for that.
just lingering,
It's, yeah, you've got to fly it over and linger where a person has a reasonable expectation of privacy, which is usually in your home. There'll be, and that's a physical trespass. We've had all sorts of examples around the country where people are using self-help, shooting down drones that they think are spying on. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. Good question. All right, so let's talk quickly about no-fly zones. So the federal law prohibits operating a drone within 5 miles of an airport or a hillport. It's within 30 miles of the Reagan airport. That's probably the most controlled airspace in our country, is in the Washington, D.C. area. A lot of people know that, but what a lot of people don't know is that the FAA also has issued, they've designated certain airspace as national security sensitive. And there are currently 617 locations that have been designated that. You can't fly any type of drone, whether it's a model aircraft, whether it's 5 feet off the ground or whatever, within that space. And then the FAA has authority to issue what they call temporary flight restrictions. So the president comes and visits. They issue a temporary flight restriction, no drones within so many miles of where the president is speaking. Got a foreign dignitary that's coming. The UN meets. In New York, they issue a temporary flight restriction while the UN is in session that will not allow the operation of drones within a certain mile radius of the UN. Why? Because drones can be a weapon. Drones pose a safety threat from terrorism and things of that nature. Other no-fly zones include national parks. The National Park Service has banned all drones from operating within the park. There are a few state parks that have enacted similar. Dead Horse State Park, Dead Horse Point State Park being one in particular. So that's what the federal law prohibits. State law also prohibits drones flying, and this gets a little too technical, we don't have time to get into it, but Class B, C, or D airspace. And basically that's around airports and above certain, airliners can fly in Class D airspace. Most drones could even, unless you were a military drone, couldn't get to that area. State law also prohibits flying near an airport without permission from the air traffic controller. Somewhat duplicative of federal law. State law also prohibits operating a drone if you're going to interfere with the operations or traffic patterns of a heliport. Now, there are a lot more heliports, certainly in the urban areas, than you might recognize and be aware of. You also, under state law, cannot fly a drone from